Thank you everyone for being here. I hope online you can hear me. We have quite some public online. There is an online audience. For the one online, we also have a live audience, which is very nice to see. We are here for the second event of this short cycle, quite short, very synthetic, I would say, related to the exhibition. We are inside the space of Archizoom here at EPFL, the exhibition Water Designs, L'eau dessine la ville, that under the direction of Paola Viganò has been curated together with Archizoom here in the last few months. In this short cycle of seminars, we're interested in discussing with you and among colleagues on water, and today more specifically on water and design. We invited Anne Whiston-Spurn a couple of weeks ago to share her perspective on what we have been trying to do here, which is very simple, I would say, and at the same time very ambitious. We share the participation of what has been defined, is regularly defined, some sort of paradigm shift in designing with water, in our designers' approach to water-related questions. And we are mainly interested today to discuss this among scholars and designers, to share their own perspectives, their visions on this hypothesis that the paradigm shift on the way in which we address water-related questions is not necessarily new, and that the emergence we see of an abundance of discourses, not only disciplinary, but also in the larger social arena, is something that has roots. That's what we have been trying to trace in this genealogy of thinking with water, the role of water in shaping inhabited territories. So in which way we conceptualize the question related with water, in which ways we conceptualize our needs in respect to water, in which ways water is helping or not our world visions. So today we will try to discuss this with three guests, so I will make it very short because as you will see, we have three fantastic guests. We would like to give them the floor for a short presentation, followed by a very open debate. We invited our students and all the students here to participate and to engage with them. My introduction of the three guests will be very short because they have very large experiences, but I will keep them strict to what we have here today on water and design. So I will do that, I think, in the opposite order compared to what you will see. We will invite them in the order from the last to the first. So we invited Taneha Bacchin, which is there. Thank you very much. Architect, urban designer. She's associate professor of urban design and critical theory at TU Delft. And she's working on water, with water, since many years, in the limit, let's say, in the relation of space, ecology, but also a lot of politics in the Dutch deltas and in other global context where climate change and extreme weather conditions are challenging our approach. So she's very close to the urban political ecologies approaches, for instance. We will discuss them in a few weeks with some of the other guests. We invited also Shannon, Professor Kelly Shannon, architect. She's teaching urbanism at KU Leuven, where she's teaching since many years and researching. She's really one of the pillars, let's say, of the KU Leuven School of Urbanism. And she's also very much interested in the relation landscapes and urbanism, the way in which these two themes, let's say these two disciplines, can interact, and in which ways, from the perspective of a designer, it's interesting to look at regions in which water is playing a major role in shaping, and hence played in the past major role in shaping condition of urbanity. Mostly, you will see some of her work are present right here, very close to me. She published a couple of books fundamental for our research, let's say, Water Urbanisms in 2008 and Water Urbanism East a few years later. She's mostly working in these two books, in the second especially with Southeastern Asia context. And lastly, which will open the roundtable today, is Chiara Cavalieri. She's also an architect, associate professor of urbanism at UCL Louvain in Belgium. And since many years, since the PhD and even before in Venice, at University of Venice, she's reflecting on the relation water forms of contemporary territory, the way in which we inhabit and the relation of this territory with water. She published recently The Language of Water, a book that we already invited our student to access online, a book that is echoing the one of Anne Winston-Spurn, The Language of Landscapes. So I propose we invite Chiara to open this short presentation. It will be very open. We invite them to reflect on why they feel today the need to still discuss on water, their regard on the brief overview they had of our exhibition, and possible suggestion on how to enlarge our genealogy, how to enrich or to question maybe some of our choices that we said since the very beginning are in a way partial and not completely exhaustive. So Chiara, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Tommaso. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paola, Tommaso, and Archizoom for the invitation. It's a very nice occasion being back here and discussing this theme that I've been, with which I've been occupied for a certain time. So we have been asked to give a short introduction of ourselves by the means of certain images, and Tommaso already did a quick overview. I would add maybe some images to help you understand the way in which I got into the theme of water throughout my background and experiences. So the first time I started to think with water was in the framework of my PhD, which was supervised by Paola Viganò, which is here, and where there was in 2012. So maybe here is worth it to say there was not the very beginning, but there was, let's say, the first cycle of research around water, of water urbanism, and there was the occasion which many scholars, and my PhD is just a small part, is also part of the research Extreme City and then Water and Asphalt, contributed to try to state the fact that water is a spatial question, first of all, and to try to take the question of risk and climate change, which was one of the core of my PhD, as an opportunity to rethink the future of our possibility. In this picture, for example, one of the implicit scenario that is there is that the hydraulic risk, which is this black figure, one day could be completely water. So how do we rethink this space? And how do we take risk as an opportunity? In this, let's say, first stage of water urbanism, as I would like to call it, at least for me, there was like this. There was also, from my side, an experimentation of different means of representation, using the description, the close reading, and different means of mapping. Try to understand how to represent water, which has a dynamic element in the space of paper or the screen, which is not so suited for representing movement. So, for example, this image is a part of the Venice Lagoon and was trying to, using as a reference the work of Dilip D'Acunha and Nura Damatur, was trying to show the topography and the microtopography as a new geography for rethinking the territory. And in this back and forth of scales, the tool of the section, you've seen the one before, a territorial scale. This is a section which is highlighting some small sample of the territory and try to rebuild a long transect, trying to understand how the topography could play an important and active role in this rethinking of the future. After, I came also to look at water as a cross-boundary and a political element. In this work, which has been led by Studio Paola Viganò and me when I was here at the EPFL, part of my postdoc. This was what is called Administration Maîtrise d'Ouvrage. So there was a consultancy to a group of politicians which had a vision, and the vision was the one of using water as the backbone for a territorial, very large park. And so again, one of the first operations was the one of putting together a series of data, a series of representations that were able to cross in different boundaries, because this space that you see here is crossing a national boundary. France and Belgium is the region, is the metropolitan region of Lille, and two different Belgian regions. So one of our work has been the one of understanding surface, underground, and small water courses as a first, let's say, territorial sign and territorial base for where to imagine a series of projects that maybe are already undergoing, but I could be participating to a long-term and larger vision. So then in 2019, when I was at UCL Louvain, the Flemish government asked for a study which was which could be used as a methodology for understanding the different water systems in plural. So they gave us a case study, but they also asked us to produce a methodology that could be replicated elsewhere. And so there, for me, it was the occasion to reflect that water is not only surface, it's not only underground, but it's much more than that. We have the drinking water, we have the sewage water, we have the runoff water, which was super important. This is like a scheme that is alpha section of alpha plan, but in what we wanted to do here, I did in collaboration with some collaborators at UCL Louvain and Latitude, Platform for Architecture and Urbanism. We wanted to, first of all, force ourselves to understand how these different systems are linked. And the second part, to try to understand that the water running through this line is always the same. So there is a continuous cycle of this water, and what we wanted to point out with this image is that each system has a process system, a proper infrastructure, proper manager, proper regulation, expertise. But there are some places where these systems are linked, and those are the places where somehow the expertise lacks sometimes of vision. We don't always see possible synergies, and where we could find some possibility of design. And then all those gray lines that you have seen, we produce a catalog, and for each one of them, we start to say from which water system to which other water system. We try to represent them in different way, and we re-propose a reading, and that's a bit the metaphor of the language. We wanted to understand how to read the language of water with the reference of Winston Spurn for sure. And also we wanted to understand what are the rules of this language and how we could write again. So there was an opening. This didn't go up to design, but the final intention of this work, which was a very short assignment, was the idea to reobserve pieces of landscape, real one. So these are really sample in one of the Belgian watershed, and reread all these elements and how these elements can go together, and where we could imagine then a new intervention on runoff water, on the roof surfaces, on combining sewage or rainwater, etc., could become the occasion for more efficient water management, especially occasion for new landscape design. A small intermezzo on a proposal that I did with a colleague for Lausanne Jardin, which has not been selected. But for me, what was interesting is where here is interesting to understand with this new, let's say, understanding of water brought me from this latter research. We reread the system of the city of Lausanne, and especially we focus on the Maladière. I don't know if you see which is here, which is a very important, if I use the methodology of before, very important node, where we have a lot of waters coming in. There is the flow underneath, there is the sewage water, there is the rainwater, and there are a lot of spillovers opening up when there is a big flooding towards the lake. So what we propose there is a very simple, but it's just an example of possible design path, let's say, is to relook at this roundabout of the Maladière, which is now known as being a main infrastructural mobility network. We have the bus stop, we have the end of the highway, we have the beginning of the natural road towards the city. But actually here underneath we have different pipes of different size, of different materials. We have bricks, we have concrete. There are a different level. And so we wanted to reveal all of this on the ground. And so this line that you see are simply three linear landscape that we propose to redraw, and that we could see using the existing path that is coming from La Vallée de la Jeunesse from the north towards the lac, and that could reveal what is happening underneath. Arrive at the end of this short story. And this is an image produced in the framework of work for the region of Brussels and the region of Flanders, where they asked us to produce an atlas of urbanization. Within this atlas, one of the key questions was the one of water. And for me, this we could say, belongs to a second family of works, where the water urbanism as a spatial question and the risk as an opportunity was already, at least for me, understood. And then the research that are been undertaken in these years are more trying to understand how water interacts with policies, and how it can become operational in transforming the cities. So in a very simple way, here again, we selected all the areas that are flooded, all the areas which are the one in yellow that are actually built on top of a covered river that is now a sewage, and all the areas that are upstream that are generating a lot of runoff, which are the one in red. And we propose this as a new hydrologic tissue. So the idea is that this could become a new way of zoning, that the regulation should take into account the fact that it's not just urbanization and cities, much dense in this case. It's not just a flat surface, but we could try to imagine a new regulation, taking into account the difference that are given by the system of water. This has been also the occasion of some studios. We built some models, we propose some designs, and we are continuing thinking in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara, also for the effort, because I didn't mention that we ask really a complex effort, the one of keeping in a few minutes both some sort of academic biography, self-biography, and to orient a bit their gaze. So thank you very much. So I propose Kelly Shannon to continue.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Tommaso and Paola for the invitation and also for the really wonderful exhibit. I think it would be nice to have time to talk about it. So what I've done is also had the task of trying to compress in a very short period of time some of the interests. I've been interested in water basically since the late 90s when I started to work in Vietnam. I continued to work in Vietnam and I continued to work about water. And in the discussion and the question asked from Paola and Tommaso is maybe how to still, if we understand this exhibit as an opening for discussion, as an opening genealogy, and in the discussion with Paola, I mean, opening it up to other geographies. For me, again, knowing that my foundation and deep interest is in Asia, particularly in Vietnam, I've now started to do a whole research about indigenous water urbanism. This a little bit stems from my discussions on landscape urbanism with colleagues in the US. For me, the kind of terming of landscape urbanism in the late 90s by Charles Waldheim and Jim Corner, saying that this was new. I didn't think it was very new, so we had some debate about that, because I think you could say as long as humans settled intelligently with landscapes, they were doing landscape urbanism before it was called an ism. Similarly with water. So for me, again, some texts that I think are really interesting, say, to add to this quite remarkable exhibit. And there are many, but I just point out two. For me is one by a really interesting man named Sumet Jumsai. Sumet Jumsai is a Thai architect, still alive. He's like 90-something. Worked with Buckminster Fuller, is a kind of nutty guy making wonderful architecture. But he's written this wonderful book called Naga, where he talks about the origins of Southeast Asian culture and how water is a deep part of the kind of cultural understandings of nations, of settling. He talks a lot about symbolism, and he talks a lot about particular cultural identities linked to this whole notion of Naga being a kind of mythical being that runs throughout Southeast Asia. And the other book is actually, I've of course, unavoidably so, Kongjianyu is omnipresent in discussions about landscape urbanism and about water urbanism. But I think one of his earlier books that he wrote with a woman named Mary Padua is called The Art of Survival. And for me, this is a very interesting book because he also talks about water management and almost as a designer, but a designer looking back on history, looking back on Chinese history, and understanding how water management, again, has been very deeply embedded in the culture, deeply linked to engineering, of course, and policies. And for him, understanding of what we can call tech, traditional ecological knowledge, and the way it can complement scientific ecological knowledge, is something I think he writes about very in a jargon-free way, the way Kongxian writes, as a very charismatic character. And for him, this whole notion of the art of survival. So it's not about making things pretty and all aesthetics, but it's really about how humans occupy the face of the earth, change it in order to survive and thrive. Okay, so now I will go a lot quicker. But for me, this is, I have to say, I'm in the middle of a research with Bruno de Mulder, who I do quite a lot of my work with. We're writing a book about the Mekong Delta. It's been going on for some years now, but we're hoping in the next. So now we have a publisher, we have a graphic designer, we have drawings, and we simply need time to write the text. Difficulties of being in our field, but we're tentatively calling the book "A World of Mud and People Passing By," and this actually comes from a French archaeologist named Louis Mallet, who actually talked when he went to the Mekong Delta in the early 20th century. He said, "This world is nothing else than mud and people passing by." So for us, it's about these traces. And it's about, again, the modifications that are made in this mud. So not so much about land and water. So again, echoing maybe some of the things of Anu Matur and Dilip da Cunha about kind of notions of wetness, being more wet or more dry. Mud can be very wet and very icky, but it can also be dry and hard. So the Mekong Delta for us, as Louis Mallet said long ago, is really remains, and its quality remains this. Of course, we now want to make clear divisions, as people like Dilip would say, between what is land and water. But in fact, if you think of it as mud, and mud that we can use and live with, it's a quite spectacular way to think of a paradigm shift, I think. So what we're doing in the maps that we're developing, we're developing this kind of book that looks at a kind of historical reading, and then has a very large atlas, and then has design lessons distilled. But our territory we're looking at is basically 16-meter elevation, what we are defining as the delta. And we're not using national boundaries, so this kind of crossing. So it's the lower part of the Mekong Delta is present-day Vietnamese territory, and then the part that's darker brown, again brown. For us, the water is brown. It's mud. It's not blue. Is in Cambodia, the Tunnel Sap Lake, which has a wonderful phenomenon of how its water works. So within this vast area, it's recognized by many ecologists as having different agroecological zones. Because when you go in the Mekong Delta today by motorbike or by boat, a lot of the territory, on first glance, if you only look at architecture and urbanism, it looks really very similar. But once you start looking at the landscape and the different vegetation, the different water practices, it really corresponds very strongly to these conditions. So we've set ourselves a kind of crazy task of developing this atlas. So we've been traveling many months by now in monsoon rains by boat, some difficult boat trips for many days. And we now have about 250 of these squares that we take drones, a lot of wonderful drone photographs. Well, we think they're wonderful. They're fun, at least. I don't know if they're wonderful. But these are basically 1.2 kilometers by 1.2 kilometers. So it's as I say, we have about 250 of them at the moment. But what's for us quite fascinating is again seeing this kind of gradients of wetness, slightly higher ground. So in white is kind of the filled land, so where humans have filled up to 3 meters. But otherwise, much of what we're interested in is trying to find the practices where people live and deal with the mud as mud, and not try to turn it into land. So just to show you the kinds of ways we're working on these drawings. I think it got shifted a little bit, but doesn't matter. So we have these. In this case, this isn't even the Mekong. It's a tributary of the Mekong, a smaller river, and you see that there's settlements in the water. There's settlements on the bank of the river. There's settlements on the dike. And then this area, again, that's in white, is a very large landfill where new urbanization happens according to tried and true, quite boring and horrible land use plans. So we're trying to understand how these different logics coexist. In that, we then take 400-meter strips. So here in the areas we're not going to do this for 250. We're going to choose about 60 of them where we have very particular elements that kind of begin to develop the vocabulary of building with the mud. So here we begin to see a very particular phenomenon in this part of Vietnam, very close to the present-day Cambodian border, where they also have these quite particular way of living in the water on fish cage houses. So these are houses that are actually wonderfully constructed of bamboo before they're then submersed. And they raise catfish, and families then live on top of their farm, aquaculture. We actually slept in houses with colleagues, and you have, in the way they live is also extended family systems. So you would often have the houses as you see them, and then they would also often be linked back to a land house where they have other activities, and also say off-season trading at their kind of doorfront. So as I say, there's for us the details aren't very important, but what's really interesting, I think, for us is to understand what is also called IKSP, so it's indigenous knowledge and spatial practices. And for us, trying to distill these the way they also are, in many cases, ethnically rooted, and in some cases also imposed by laws and by policies. So this is an area actually very close to a large city in the Vietnamese part again, called Can Tho, and it's an area that is based on this incredible kind of natural water system that hasn't been canalized, and where there's not a lot of natural high levees from the pressure of the sedimentation that has brought this kind of natural higher grounds, and where there's an incredible system of orchards. So it's a system where they say monoculture hasn't yet really taken over, thankfully, and where different households, again, extended kind of almost family compounds, live in connection and on the river, on the high alluvial banks, and then where they say irrigate carefully away, as you see in the small kind of lines, to bring into play this very highly productive landscape that is much more, for farmers, it's much more lucrative than rice, and it's actually much healthier for the environment, because they tend to work on a cyclic system where they also have small husbandry, and it all works as a kind of self-fertilizing system. So it's really again, traveling around, understanding there's quite a different variety in a very huge territory, all based on water and mud. So for us, of course, the great fun, I could say, of field work and of getting, say, lost in analytical drawings is only as good as it's useful to be projective. So we've also been involved over I could say almost now decades with the Vietnamese government, working on different projects. This was a project, it's only in the Vietnamese part because it was commissioned by the Vietnamese government. They wouldn't have been happy if we showed Cambodia. But this is a project that worked as a design for 18 million people, so it's very large, as a way to address the consequences of global warming, trying to accentuate these agroecological zones, trying to rebuild mangroves. A lot of mangroves have been kind of chopped down, again, for aquaculture, for shrimp farming. A lot of shrimp that you might eat comes from Vietnam. But also up in the north, at the border of Cambodia, creating a kind of monsoon reservoir, so kind of gigantic bathtubs, basically, to hold massive monsoon rains and to release it into the system. So the idea is, again, understanding how the indigenous logics work, how to upscale that, and how to bring it into urbanism is part of what we've been busy with. Another more recent project that kind of got cut short was for a private developer. We think we quit, and she thinks she fired us. Funny story, but it was an area for a development of basically a suburb of Saigon, of Ho Chi Minh City, in the south, where we looked at developing a system of urbanism that would allow people to commute by water, by boat, which of course the developer wasn't in favor of, because its development paradigm is all about roads. But it was all based on kind of developing a water transport system, and then an area in the middle that was for large public programs and islands around a water management system. And then even in the south part of this plan, combining aquaculture and agriculture. And for us, it was really working, so in the kind of urban blocks, it was working on a system of how to kind of interweave the car, still the kind of symbol of success in a emerging economy like Vietnam, but how to kind of literally kind of put that in a system together to weave it with a water system. So trying to come to a new way to understand and to revalue the water that has been very much part of the initial, and I would say the fearing to be lost identity of a place like Vietnam and much of the reason of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
I would like to thank you as well, Paola and Tommaso, for this beautiful invitation to have the honor to be with all of you today. I think my presentation is slightly a bit different from Chiara and Kelly. It's more, let's say, on the perhaps giving a bit of context of I'm Brazilian, working and living in the Netherlands. So of course, water culture is something that it's very much part of the blood, let's say, of the DNA of Dutch design and Dutch culture, let's say, in general. So I did a bit of a reflection, let's say, of that, and especially then reaching out to a project that we have been working in the context of São Paulo, Brazil, and if time allows, also a project in India. But something that we have been, let's say, in the context of designing with water that we have been working with, it's some of those notions of, let's say, of envisioning new imaginaries, radical, we might say, ways forward, but especially then how actually we might work with translations, no? So coming from different cultures, so these knowledge transpositions, no? That quite common, they happen between places. So translations, transpositions, but also how actually we might react to incidents. And something that happened actually quite recently in the context that I have been working now in Brazil. So what we have basically experiencing is this sort of shift between, let's say, what is foreground and what is background in each project, what are the voices that are actually being heard and the ones that are by design perhaps being excluded. So how we can keep the dynamic, let's say, ongoing, being sensitive to actually to the context, to the sites, no, and develop the design practice that it's more responsive to that, and also that actually it's capable of being in dialogue with such dynamics. Perhaps another interesting aspect is this idea of, actually this comes from a beautiful book, The Changing Constitution of the Present, that it's a book about environmental design, actually the field of art in relation to environmental questions and political, especially political ecology questions. And the book brings forward the point that, well, we are now actually the condition of contemporary, the condition of multiple times. So we have the geological time, the historical time, but also the experiential time. And actually how this sort of multiplicity, the juxtaposition of different time spans, of different perceptions, might also shape the idea of the project. So coming with some urgencies, something that it's quite, well, obvious, but normally we don't take into account, especially in water-related designs, in close connection with, again, between water engineering, spatial planning, spatial design, that urbanization does have a direct, let's say, impact on water performance. But that's something that, unfortunately, it's not normally taken into account. This was a concept that also it's part of the beautiful exhibition. So the casco concept, it's quite interesting because it comes from a design competition that happens in the Netherlands from time to time, and that it's really the space to move, let's say, forward paradigms, so actually for paradigm shifts. And that was the foundation of what we see today in the Netherlands as being, let's say, the current practice of dealing with water safety in general. So this idea of shifting between flexible, a framework for safety, for water, so space for water, but also flexible spaces that could actually be in dialogue with changing needs of society, economy, and culture. And another point to close this part, also this idea of, let's say, as in the gardens of Piet Oudolf, in this context, the idea of even 5 seasons. So we have 4 seasons plus the transition between seasons, that actually we have to keep on try as much as possible to work with this idea again of coexistence, no? Of different ways of being, of different, let's say, again, temporal and spatial conditions happening at the same time. So some projects coming from this idea of imaginaries. So starting with, Room for the River, which is now, let's say, the current paradigm that we have been working in the Dutch context. I brought 2 projects from HNS, Landscape Architects, which are somehow, let's say, the foundation of the guidelines, the design guidelines that have been put forward. And what is interesting is that even, so the project was a reaction, so came from the casco concept, but actually it was implemented after the floods of 93 and 95 as a reaction to what happened. So unfortunately, we need to have a catastrophe for a reaction in design, really this paradigm actually to shift. And you see here this idea of as simple as, providing more transitional space, no? So this sort of spaces in between the mud, basically, no? Between land and water. But the point here is what might be the implications from the point of view not only of water safety, but especially of spatial quality. So it has been a quite strong, let's say, point brought forward that even if we are dealing with questions of water, actually we have it's about space, no? As said before by Chiara and Kelly, it's about actually spatial production and the dynamics of nature embedded in that. You can see here some of the pictures of the, let's say, of the constructed projects and how, again, of course, the Netherlands is being, fully constructed by man, but how actually this also has been shifting, let's say, conditions of the landscape more recently. Another project in relation to this also idea, let's say, of the room for the river is questioning the dikes. No, so the dikes, it's claimed that in the Netherlands the dikes is a state. No, so the state of the delta, actually the political force in the Netherlands, it's actually the dike system. And this project questioned the very idea of the dike and brings, let's say, a change in that, something that actually can be more as well, in that sense, more. Perhaps not more flexible, but that can be somehow that has a different morphology in the landscape. So it's lowered than the traditional dikes. It can be eroded. The adjacent, let's say, landscape type actually can come and take over the dike. So it's this idea of hybridicity, again, of coexistence, of juxtaposition of different forms of design and performances. So kind of taking, let's say, the traditional way of looking into a engineered system, and trying to be a little bit more, let's say, hybrid in that way. And you can see here the construction works and the testing actually of this. This dike scheme actually won quite some prizes because of, let's say, of this idea of breaking a bit of the engineering rigidity of it, but actually functioned quite well during the recent floods in 2021 in the south of the country. Then finally, we have been also in the context of TU Delft. We have been, we know we have room for the river, but it's not enough because we have extreme, let's say, scenarios in front of us. So we have been, let's say, studying and exploring what might be actually, if we take business as usual, what could be the Netherlands if we stay as we are, let's say. And you can see that most of the country will be below underwater. So from an engineering perspective, again, there are some scenarios, let's say, being discussed. And you can see in this cartoon type of drawings, they're quite, extreme in themselves. But the point is that we might not have not one or other, but actually the mix of these different possible responses. And from a design exploration point of view, what we've tried to do is to see, okay, we have different what we call the landscape moments in the Dutch context. What might be then the design, let's say, interventions, the design approach that best, let's say, that could be best in dialogue with which one of these different types of landscapes, again, facing extremes. We invited 15 offices in this idea of the interdisciplinary design between landscape architecture, urban design, and engineering companies. And in 5 design teams for the 5 landscape moments, they developed different projects. They didn't bring them here, but it was quite interesting because they decide, the 15 offices, they decide to come together and to write a manifesto, a sort of manifesto like the SIAM, in which they say, you can see in the codes, so we are here to stay, so we have to take responsibility. We have to take painful decisions. So let's say the adaptation that is needed in the Dutch context now, it's quite severe to face, let's say, this climate scenarios that we have in front of us. We have to utilize what is called the delta paradox, meaning this, let's say, being in this transitional condition between land and water, and the importance of working with tectonics, of working with the section. So really in this sort of, again, the architecture of surface, subsurface, but also atmospheric conditions. Going back to the Casco concept, so the design competition that happens from time to time, it's called the Year of Eyes design competition, and it happened in 2023, the last one. And the entry that won is this project, again by HNS and Paubond Landscape Architects, Landscape Urbanists, and it's a very interesting concept. So this is the new concept now that the city of Rotterdam is using to develop the strategic climate adaptation plan for the year 2150. So, and the main point here is this idea of that there are the land of 2 waters, so basically subdividing the waterways in 2 different forms of management. So one, let's say the Netherlands, it's alive because of dredging. So it's a country of constant dredging to keep, let's say, water levels under controlled, and especially for logistics and transportation purposes. But the point of the project was to say, well, we have these scenarios. There are several shifts that might happen from the point of view of, let's say, of economy, society, well, of course, environment. So we have to be able to respond to them. So we have to let go of part, let's say, of the over-control over natural processes that we have now in the country. So the project brings this idea that to allow sediments to be deposited again in some of the river branches. This is it's quite radical for the Dutch context. So to welcome sediments and to allow them to stay in the Dutch estuary, actually the Netherlands, it's more estuary than the delta. So this is what the project brings forward, and that it sees, and you can see here it's the Rotterdam with the extension of the port. So, and actually it sees, well, what might be the benefits from the point of view of, let's say, of surface hydrology, hydraulics, but especially also from, let's say, ecological purposes, biodiversity, and, let's say, the potential qualities, spatial, land use, actually changes that the project might bring forward because of this welcoming, let's say, of natural processes and the indeterminacy of them. You can see here in the section, in the left part, it's the current section. In the right part, what the project proposes. So one of the waterways is, let's say, left to the uncontrolled process of sediment deposition. Then finally, the final project, so this is now moving to São Paulo. We have been working with the University of São Paulo, the Faculty of Architecture, since 2012 in the context of let's say, a joint research project and exchange with students, especially because we have been quite inspired by what is called the Waterway Ring, so the Metropolitan Waterway Ring project of São Paulo, in this idea of transpositions of river systems. And actually it's about also something that Paulo Mendes da Rocha used as a concept, the idea of constructed geographies. So this comes actually from even an idea of the father of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, which was a hydraulic engineer in which he envisioned the internal, let's say, an internal coastline in South America with the connection of all the waterway systems, let's say, in the South American context. And this idea of connecting rivers actually has been shaping the idea of the research group at FAO, the University of São Paulo, really to see what might be, let's say, how the cities along river networks have been developing historically, and what might be ways forward in relation to that. So you can see I'm shifting down in scales from the South American context to the Brazilian context. Now we are in the Paraná basin. You can see in the bottom part, it's the city of São Paulo. And the idea of the project is actually to connect, let's say, several river branches in the context of São Paulo, and then finally to the basin level. Here it's the metropolitan, what it's called the Metropolitan Waterway Ring around the meta-metropolis of São Paulo. It's a massive area. And what the project does is so there are two rivers, and then the project proposes an artificial canal of 100 kilometers, which then closes the loop. And the project brings this idea of combining, in an industrial ecology perspective, combining water management, waste management, mobility, urban mobility. So it take out from the, let's say, the road mobility network, the cargo, especially of waste management, 5 different cargos of waste, and it brings to the fluvial system. And by doing that, also you have, let's say, the full recycling of waste, the management of water, of urban water, and especially, design of public equipments and, let's say, the urbanized landscape. This is FAO, so the Faculty of Vila Nova Artigas in São Paulo, with the exhibition of the project. I brought some pictures just to show you how also the project moves between scales. So very detailed, they call the architecture of infrastructure with the multiple use of water, which is part of Brazilian law. So from the full system at basin level down to the metropolitan level, finally to the, let's say, the architecture of specific nodes of the infrastructure, really engineering all the parts along. And then to conclude, the idea of incidents. So I'm from the south of Brazil. I don't know if you heard, but we experienced in May extreme floods. So we had 5.35 meters of water above river and lake level. So it was extreme. The region, this is the state of Rio Grande do Sul. It's 7 times the Netherlands. It's as big as Italy, taking out Sicily. You can see in this picture from NASA the rivers. Actually, normally you would not see them, but this was during the floods. The state has 497 cities, from which more than 450 cities were heavily destroyed. This is the capital city of Porto Alegre. You can see during the flood, so most of the city actually underwater. And then the question to close to all of us, let's say, it's how actually from a design perspective, what is really the agency of design when something like this happens? So how actually we can, from, again, designing with natural processes, with greenery, with green, let's say with landscape, matrices, how effective we can be to be able to cope with such event. And this has been a political question, actually, that I have been involved since May with the state government and with some of the municipalities and with the federal government in Brazil to see actually what are the implications of design. How can we actually take long-term visioning, so really working with, let's say, visions for climate adaptation in the long term and actually bring that back to the urgency of responding and reconstructing everything that was destroyed. So how to make design decisions in a way that actually we are capable to, in a systemic way, to better cope and prepare for something that just in the last year we had 10 extreme events in the region, just in 1 year. And you can see this is some of the islands in the delta. The city is facing the delta, which also the most vulnerable population is living. So final questions, of course, spatial justice and spatial and climate justice, we cannot escape that, but the question again is how actually design can be in dialogue with this. And maybe a point forward is that, well, to really use the basin as a unit of planning, design, and governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would invite now our 3 guests to sit here with me, and we invite, of course, Paola Viganò. We profit of the fact that the 4 of you have been working with water, on water, reflecting for many times. So I ask you, Paola, to maybe start reacting to the presentation. Of course, we invite everybody else to join the conversation. So please, let's take Paola's role just as an opening.
In fact, I would say that I have a lot of questions and a lot of starting discourses that I would like to enlarge with Taneha, Chiara, and Kelly. But I would really like to know if there are from the public some questions. I don't know if the students, I'm speaking to the students that just came back from Paris, where yesterday afternoon we had a meeting with a lady engineer responsible of the water management in Paris. And she was, in a way, passing from what Chiara was showing, speaking about sewage systems, speaking about all the different forms of water, to the big question of risk that you, Taneha, were passing through the idea of designing with water. I mean, it's interesting because we have seen here several very interesting point of view. But what is interesting is that they are very, very concrete, and in fact, every city is trying to cope with in many different conditions, with more or less risk, with more or less scenography, let's say, with more or less types of landscapes. But in fact, these are really questions for our everyday life. So maybe I don't know if some of the students would like to bring some questions or some parts of your experience. In Paris, with the master and bachelor group, we are working on a hidden river, in fact, La Bièvre, that has disappeared, but in fact, from the center of the city. But in fact, the ghost of this river is really everywhere, and people are always speaking of this ghost. And then finally, we could see the river the river alive, and it was a big satisfaction, I think, that to see that finally there was a river at a certain moment. So, no questions. You prefer that I open the box? Ah, okay. Okay. But there are so many things. I can start from something very personal. Kelly has really brought, I would say, the theme of water in Europe. You said that it started with the interest started with the work, the PhD you were doing in Vietnam for several years. And Kelly made a fantastic PhD thesis, and I had the chance to be there at the moment. I was part of the jury, and it was really very, very interesting. And then immediately after, she, in a way, proposed to think about this. Relation between the city and water. I remember there was probably a kind of biennale in Turkey, and then it didn't happen. But at that moment, I started to think about it, and I found that it was so fascinating, so impressive. And then I would say we started also a long-lasting friendship starting from this water aspect. But Chiara, she said that she started again with me, and the Lagoon of Venice was her first object of research. Very difficult. I would say one of the most difficult questions you can have, because on one side you have the problem of the survival of this lagoon, of the islands, but then you have all the heritage aspect that is not a small thing, and where you can be you can agree on doing very crazy things just in the name of maintaining Venice. No, you can accept even crazy ideas like the one some scientists, which is very strange, are now bringing, like transform the lagoon in a lake, like in some parts of Holland. And Taneha also had a small time, not a small, quite a long time also in Venice. She studied also at the School of Architecture in Venice, and then now she's becoming very Dutch. In fact, she's really integrating. You said that, it's kind of state problem. If you are a Dutch citizen, well, you have to speak about water. You have to take a position about water, and I think that. But for example, I want to say that behind Taneha there was, because now he has retired, a professor, Han Meyer, that founded a chair of Delta urbanism. So Kelly started to speak about water urbanism. And some years after, Han Meyer proposed to have a new chair at the School of Delft, in a chair that was really connected to the delta condition. As you know, the delta condition is a very urban condition. There are so many millions of people that are living on delta. So when you say that there is a specific delta urbanism, you are dealing with the most inhabited areas in the world and the most risky areas in the world. So it is quite convincing, the idea of having a chair dedicated to that. So this just to contextualize a little bit the four guests. Now, my first question would be, but the reason why we did this exhibition, not just because we were asked to collaborate, and we were very happy, of course, with Archizoom, but my first point is when this paradigm shift happened. It is clear that today we think about water, we reflect about water, we design water in a different way. But first of all, the presence of the theme is much more important, but also, as I think, Chiara, you were saying, that the spatial character of water, the importance of dealing with water when you speak about urbanization, when you speak about the city, not as a marginal question, but as a fundamental one. But in which way, in which moment, through which scholars, ideas, books, a new paradigm was formed? Because I think that today we can say that there are new paradigms that are very different from only the way in which we were speaking about water 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. In general, then maybe there was always some good pioneer. But in general, let's say, the engineers were speaking of water as something to be evacuated as soon as possible. Architects and urbanists were not really dealing with water, except maybe for the waterfront theme that emerged in the 80s, in the 90s, but it was more a scenographic idea of how you valorize the city on the water. So my first question is to the three of you. Where do you individuate this moment or this series of moments or of ideas that changed our way to think and to design water? And I think Kelly is the first one that should.
Well, I think to a certain degree, the era of the invention of the hydraulic pump, when we started looking in also ancient water practices and understanding that in different parts of the world there were very different technologies of water management. But then in the 1950s everything changed because we could drill, we could pump, but we didn't have to. So I think between the 50s and the end of the 2000s, we are in this kind of, I would almost say, glorification of Dutch engineering that spread globally, unfortunately, I would also say. Because we have the money, we have the science, we can engineer it all away. And then I think with the rise of people like Rachel Carson and the whole environmental movement, that you could stay started with other crises, but there started, I think, to be an acknowledgement that maybe somehow our great technologies and engineering, whether it's pesticides or water management, will come back and bite us in the butt. No, I think really, and it became the start, I would say, so overlapping, so still in the heyday of engineering, so out of sight, out of mind, evacuate as quick as possible, going on, but then already in the 70s, taking dips with politics and limits of growth, and but then I think when, for instance, in Europe, when the Greens became kind of in power, I think it also started changing minds, not only of people like Ian McHarg and designers, but also politicians, which made a fundamental shift. So to me, it started really getting the ball rolling in the end of 90s. And I think the paradigm shift is, as we know, even a lot of the words in this paradigm shift, they're not kind of, they are somehow looking back, nature-based solutions, trying to learn from ancient practices. So, of course, technology is, you can't deny technology, and so the kind of growth of technology and engineering, but at the same time, understanding that alone. So for me, this paradigm shift, it's not for me, I would never be able to give it a date. I think it's a lot of overlapping. And that's why I think what's so nice about your exhibit, by the way, of these 4 themes. So if you have them, so to me, what's interesting of urbanism, landscape, and territorial design, together with legislation, is those are creative projective acts. Mm-hmm. So legislation is also creative, if I wasn't an architect, I would be a politician. No, I mean, it's a creative thing. Absolutely. Whereas I think the other two, environmental engineering and thinking and political ecology, are somewhat more analytical. And so I think, and they both need each other. So I think the lens, and so I think this paradigm shift as a kind of wave and overlapping degrees of things occurs in all of the different ones in different times. And then when they kind of have a happy coexistence, that's when things really come alive.
But if I can ask you, for example, when you put your mud and the wetness, no? So where the line of the river does not exist anymore, it is even dangerous not to look at this line. This is really something that is changing our way of thinking culturally, completely, and it is maybe also with your attention to the indigenous techniques. This also means to really open our mind. No, it's really putting aside a lot of ideas and entering in a new world, but also in a new world of imagination. No? Because if you start to say that you don't look at the line of the river, but you just work on the different degrees of wetness, and this is really making of every, say, solid matter something that you don't see anymore. I think this is really deep, and it's true that there is not one point, but what is happening is something that is really changing us in deep.
Thank you, Paola. I don't have an answer to your question direct, but I'm tending to think as Kelly, as more like some cycles. My perception that I had, but let's say I'm a generation after you, so you brought water urbanism in Europe, and I started studying as many other PhD, these teams. For me, one of the things that changed a bit the rules of the game is when from research is converging with, let's say, is able to shape new policies. And so when actually for implementing more room for the waters, new water integrated management strategies, we don't need design anymore. That's when the implementation is there. We always need design, but in the sense that is a lesson learned, and it became the business as usual. And in some places, it is the case. We see these small ditches that are becoming filtration basins, and there is no designer, no whatsoever. It's just the government, little by little, it became a practice. So for me, there is also the shift then where research in the large sense, design, engineer, political ecologists, managed to inform policies, then for me is a shift. We might have a new one, and of course, as Kelly was saying, there are always some pioneers in the past. So, for example, for me, one pioneer which is more towards not the more room for rivers, but is towards the integrated thinking of let's say urban and hydraulic space is the embarkment of the River Thames in the 19th century. Of this engineer Bolzet, which with the occasion of simply building the pipe, he rebuilt the old public space along the Thames. And for me, that would be one of the pioneer that, for different reasons, as the Emerald Necklace would be there, because it is a team today, and it is a team. I think in the implementation strategies, the fact that we don't think at the infrastructure as a possible project. And so a very basic discussion that I had with many administration is that there is not a coordination. I open a street, I change a pipe, and then would be the occasion of rethinking the space on many layers, mobility, soil, project of soil, many other things. And it's difficult to have this coordination, and some project did that 2 centuries ago. So for me, that is one way of paradigm shift. And a second one that I think, and Kelly mentioned, and is also present in the exhibition, but maybe we didn't discuss enough today, is how the practice of water have been a bit obliterated by the process of urbanization. And I think the work of Kelly is putting that forward. But also Matthew Gandhi, for example, he wrote this wonderful. He wrote many wonderful texts. We agree, but there's one of the Paris sewer that you made me think. Talking about Paris, which clearly says explains that the process of urbanization explains modernization as a way of obliterating collective practice around water. And so this all re-coming, which again is today in Brussels is very present, in many cities very present, but we see with the work of with Spern that it's not new. This is all citizen science and trying to implement things with local community for building a larger project. I think it has a lot to do with what Matthew Gandhi was saying. I mean, this collectivity that has been lost is also because we have been cancelling in a way or in another. So I don't know if it is a paradigm shift, but there are many initiatives. But in a way, some of the projects of Lausanne Jardin try to open up with not just a beautiful installation, but like open up with some participatory practice, sensibilization. There is this wonderful experience in Brussels, which is from 2012. It's an ONG. It's called EGEB, États Généraux des Eaux à Bruxelles. They are receiving money from different fundings, mainly from the region, and there are research funding, but the research funding which are allocated only if it's called co-create program. That they are 2 generations, and they are the only one that got the first and the second because they're like pioneers. Is allocated only if the main applicant is not a university. So university can participate, but just on the side with citizens, association, etc., etc. And they are building, they're activists. They're building many exhibitions, they're building many raining gardens, they're building many collective tanks inside the... Again, this is not the design thinking, but it's a way of shifting the way in which we perceive wetness, the way in which might be a next paradigm. We have been understanding that we need space water, but we understand that, for example, rain is maybe one of the first elements before it touches the ground, maybe to rethink about it. I don't know if I answered the question. Of course.
Actually, well, just to complement, but I was thinking about the idea of we have been trying, I think, especially in the most since the 90s, to break down the idea of taming nature. No, so if we start, of course, with examples of Frederick Law Olmsted or Ian McHarg, no, so the idea of linking on a regional design level. Reorganizing the territory from the point of view of green and water spaces, no? But then still very much on a design-controlled way. And I think that something of this, let's say, of these conditions of extremes led us to think about, well, that we have to embrace uncertainty. So what does that mean from the point of view of design? So indeed, so to work with these different gradients, no? So there is not a line, but it's a zone, that it has different ways of behaving. It means that we're going to lose control, that we're not going to be able to dimension infrastructure, water infrastructure, as we have been used to do that. And I think it has an implication because when we are, let's say, designing, again, on a regional scale, we have urban, peri-urban, rural, natural, let's say, landscapes. But when we are in the city, I'm wondering how much actually we have changed the morphology, the urban form. We are still living, I think, with the logic and with the form of cities from the past century. So how much of course, we have been water-sensitive urban design. There have been many transitioning models of water engineering in relation to spatial design, trying to connect more, again, drainage, infrastructure with open spaces, but I'm wondering how much actually that led to a fundamental change in urban form. So maybe I can somehow relate more with this paradigm, also what I showed, from the Dutch, let's say, context, this idea of room for the river, but you see these are, let's say, in large scale levels, with implications for, let's say, points in which the river touched the city. However, how much actually that has been, again, changing, let's say, the network of open spaces inside the cities. And So I don't know if we are still in that level. I think we have been benefiting a lot from the let's say contamination of landscape ecology, landscape architecture, no, in the urban design, spatial planning, also governance. Water governance has been extremely important, picking up more of the question. But I don't know if I can point out now, from thinking of the urban, and especially as you've mentioned, Paola, the delta urbanism question, no? So how much actually port cities they have in the past, let's say in the past century, in the past decades, they have been changing models. We are still, I think, constructing with a certain level of control as we used to have in the past. And maybe just a final point, so moving from, so that cities, they, especially urban infrastructure was developed from a hygienistic point of view, no? So to take water out as fast as possible, we have to keep water in now. Again, how much actually that has been changing our way of thinking of producing space.
I have a simple question. How should we be thinking, or can you expand upon this notion of mud? And how we should be thinking about mud?
A lot of people have written about mud, actually. I'm reading a book at the moment about New Orleans by Richard Campanella, and his whole first chapter of New Orleans is also about mud. And he talks about how mud is... so before we thought mud was bad, no? Because a lot of... health and hygiene has kind of made synonymous mud with disease and with bad omens, and that you need to be on dry land to be safe and to be healthy, and to have clean, clear water, not muddy water. No, so mud has, I think, in many cultures, but it's also different in different cultures. But many cultures has a very negative connotation. And I think what's nice about Richard Campanella's text and all, what we also discovered in spending a lot of time in the mud in Vietnam, is that there's a whole kind of richness and life in the mud. There's a whole, in this area that I didn't show, but in this area in Cambodia, in the Tunnel Sap Lake, for instance, it's an incredible lake because when the water becomes very strong, the river reverses its direction, and this lake increases its surface area by about 5 times and its height by about 10 meters. But in the dry season, there's still a lake, and officially, even by, say, people who look at the biology of the lake, they identify like 7 different degrees of muddiness and vegetation, and with that, it's considered one of the richest biologies, and with incredible kind of aquatic life, which incidentally, massive Chinese project wants to kind of turn it all into land and say that this mud is no good. We just need like what we know, agriculture. But this mud is it's also, I think, what you realize in Vietnam, it's not. In Cambodia, it's not feared. Like you play in the mud and people work in the mud, and it's not considered icky. I mean, of course you wash off your muddy feet before going to a kind of civilized house, but it's I think for me it's about trying to understand some of the different say, if you look back to someone like Rudowski, who wrote about architecture without architects, and this kind of non-pedigree way of understanding the world, I think for me that's where there's great lessons, and that's why for me I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not doing ethnology, but the reason I find it so fascinating is looking at all this mud and the, say, traditional ways of dealing with water, is to use it with design. So that's where I think someone like this Sumet Jumsai, who's a kind of wacky designer, and then Kong Jian-yu, because if you actually look to Kong Jian-yu's strategies, it's all based actually, and he acknowledges very, very openly that it's based on understanding conditions of mud, getting rid of these kind of planning norms that have taken over the world of land use and wet and dry. So I think for me, mud is also, it's materiality, but also as a metaphor. I think it's to dare to be muddy and not be so clear is part of what we can do as a way of rethinking these paradigms.
I have a question about the São Paulo water ring, and in which way is it positive that you bring water from one river to another one?
It's a clarification question. What is the status of this project? If it's just a research project, is something?
So maybe starting with your. So the state was that. So what I showed was the preliminary phase. So it has been commissioned by the city of São Paulo and the state of São Paulo, and now we are entering the second phase, the second stage. So it started in 2010, and now we are in 2024. So a lot of politics in the middle. Which is the phase towards execution, hopefully. So let's see. Especially the city of São Paulo took the project as one of the main, let's say, one of the main initiatives to move on. Because São Paulo has a massive problem with transportation. So we have, there is, if I'm not mistaken, about 14,000 I forgot now the exact number, but there is an extreme amount of CO2 produced per year, of which 80% comes from transportation. So the main point of the project is that the waters, they are not connected. So you have two rivers, and then we have the artificial canal, and plus the Billings Reservoir. They do not connect. They are different systems. But let's say you can move potentially between them. And the main point of the project is exactly of this urban mobility. So you take, as I was saying, you take the cargo, let's say especially of public goods, of public waste, you take from the road infrastructure and you transpose it to the fluvial infrastructure. So by doing that, there is a, let's say, and also the project envisions to use, for instance, the design of new boats which are based on hydrogen use, on new forms of, let's say, of green energy. So there is a lot of research at, let's say, different levels going on. From the boat design, which has been, because it has to navigate in very shallow water, up to the level of the full metropolitan system, as I show in the drawing. So it's a quite what for us has been fascinating of being close to this project. It's this the fact that it takes several different scales at the same time. So it goes again from the point of view of engineering a boat up to the full system, how it works, and it's especially the connection with this idea of what they call civic design. So actually, how does the project will be, let's say, of benefit from the point of view of, let's say, the implementation of new public equipments, especially also the waste which is being collected and let's say and navigated and moved in the fluvial system. It's being treated in different what they call tri-ports. So they are ports which are conceived for different forms of recycling of the different cargos of waste, and this is done in connection with schools. So also especially with communities. So it provides for jobs. Let's say, so there is a full scope, let's say a socio-economic, political scope behind the very idea of the project, which is again a connection between water, waste and mobility management.
I was wondering, since you all in some way practice or design with contemporary systems and projects, how you've encountered risk being discussed in projects, because it seems to me risk is sort of in all the presentations and many of the discussions. And obviously it comes with different values that have changed over time. And I wonder, in your experiences, what specifically is at risk and for whom? Because it seems if we don't discuss those specificities, then it's very hard. It becomes a universal threat that we all agree with. And I imagine in your different scenarios, very particular things are at risk, whether it's food security, land prices. There are probably some very concrete things that are at risk for some, maybe not universal groups of people. So I wonder how you encounter that in your projects.
For me, the whole risk story is quite interesting one. When we were officially working for the Vietnamese government, we met a lot with hydraulic engineers and people from science, from university, and so Vietnam was one of the first countries in the world that put in the line ministry a climate adaptation person in every single line ministry, because they knew that they're a country that's one of the higher risks. They have 2 big deltas, they have an enormous coast. And they were constantly making all of these risk assessments based on IPCC, blah, blah, blah. But what was quite astonishing is that when you talk in a room with in the university or in a research institute, they know the risk is and the predictions are here, but the government would only allow them to report this because they didn't want to scare the population. They didn't. So risk was highly politicized in Vietnam, and you couldn't dare talk about the extreme risk. I remember when we were working in the Mekong Delta, the New York Times published a plan of the Mekong Delta, saying a revision based on risks, that basically by the year 2100, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam is completely underwater. You were not allowed to show this plan in Vietnam. Risk became highly politicized. But to me, the kind of flip side of all of that is, who does it affect? Because the idea still, I have to say, of progress and of development is not to deal with mud, not to have floating houses, not to have houses on high stilts, but to kind of become Western, to become modern, to live on the ground, to live in a concrete house. So all the development pushes to that, whereas it's making the risk much more. No, I have to say we made this. Instead of saying that the way without architects, without urbanists, that a lot of the territory has been settled, it deals very well with risk. Okay, risk is changing, but still there is a kind of adaptability to the architecture and urbanism. But because risk is being so politicized, and it's going in parallel with this kind of mode of to be modern, and it's making the risk that much worse because it's turning everything into a impermeable surface. It's raising, filling all the earth. So there's a kind of the risk and the models, and then I think, at least in the context of Southeast Asia, the risk is very much tied to also perceptions of development and of highly politicized kind of benchmarking of what that risk is. Whether it's in the case, it's also a lot of, as you say, food security, water security, and even in many of these places we talk about extreme flood, but it's also extreme drought. So it's the kind of and many others, and the kind of socio-ecological justice is also, before you could say it was a little more evenly spread, and now the risk is being also more pushed to the more vulnerable populations, I think.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Lila, for the question. It's not an easy one, and I think it also depends from the nature of, let's say, from where this research or design is coming from. If you have a brief or not, if it's just pure research, and especially if in the case study or in this situation, the risk is still ideal, or we actually had a catastrophe would happen, and then we discuss about actual fact. I just take as an example, when I was studying the region of Venice, I was especially talking about climate change. And so, for example, sea level rising, which was so far in the idea, but in the politics idea. So there was really a mismatch in the timing of climate and the timing of policies. We have like a cycle of 5-6 years of legislation. Nobody wants to talk about that. So actually the reception of what I was doing on the political level was, I would say, close to zero, although it was the region that paid. There were regional funding that paid my research. And if I make like kind of a comparison, at the same moment, there were some PhD of Kelly working for the government, and they were working with the government. I'm thinking about Isabella and Christiane, etc., etc. So, first of all, again, maybe the shift. It depends when and where. That there are some differences. That's maybe the first point, and that it depends from the brief, because sometimes I always like to think that some briefs are the one that are also making our discipline to get a bit forward. In the small assignment, there was the one of Flemish government. I was astonished, again coming from Italy, where I had no like a wall. Them asking to architects. That we always have the problem. There is another risk of like overstepping to somebody else's expertise. What do you know about water? You're an architect. I'm an hydraulic engineer. I'm the guys managing all the navigable waters in Belgium, and there is no space, there is no properties, there is no time, there is no money for doing whatsoever you are talking about. But again, if in a way they're especially in this case, the government, it depends from the people. Sometimes the brief is ready, let's say, opening ground to transdisciplinary discussion, at least, or some knowledge transfer in between the different disciplines that helps. So I would say the risks are many. It depends a lot from the nature of this in between research and design. Because if you have a brief, then it is easier. If it is like really poor research, which you have the intellectual also freedom to push it a bit forward, sometimes you find a wall, or simply is not received, which in the case of research I think is one of the worst, because sometimes it's applied. At the end, what I did with my PhD, I did a few steps back. I did some design proposal, but I proposed a cartography, simply looking very closely for where this risk would be. So I said, okay, this environmental justice is not in the culture, but let's spatialize it and at least provide, if they want to look at it, okay, to try to understand who was at risk in the region. Again, not big discussion on this. But for me, it was kind of a positive cultural shock from Italy to Belgium, I have to say. Last year, I've been in a internal roundtable for an article that was published in the Architecture Plus. It was a number about water. And so the whole theme about the roundtable was, we have to speed up. We're not doing enough for water. I mean, the result of this is climate change. Okay, we have to speed up, but I'm Italian, and there are a lot of things going on here. There were really was APV Architecture Workcom, the Joachim de Klerk, the chair of this roundtable, and sometimes I was the only not Belgian around the table. And sometimes we had this. I say, okay, but for me, sometimes we are at the limit of a paradox, because there are a lot of things going on. It's true that for Dutch it's the same. You have a bigger risk, but you did a lot of things that you had to push forward. So for me, it was a kind of a cultural, a positive shock. The fact that our experimentation, even taking some risk, were taken into consideration in a political table, but just for, let's say, a back and forth for improving research, and then to see how this could influence and advance in a way.
For me, this was a really great exhibit. I say it again, because to me, I was really happy to discover things I never heard of. And I think one that is really this one you had of Phil Lewis of the Wisconsin State Regional Plan. I think what was so brilliant also about the small caption that you wrote, I mean, and the focus is, it was where to not build. So, you know, we're I think always obsessed, like, I'm going to make my project here and my project there, and I'm going to build this there. And it was where to not build. And I think if that was already so cleverly done in the 60s, that also the importance of design is not only to build, but to recognize where the risk, where to not build, or maybe it's not where to not build, but where to build differently, you know? So I think this 1963 project that you showed for me was also a really wonderful one to see, because it came from the perspective of not a projective as making a project, but also more reflective of what to recognize as risk, even though that wasn't the language, or maybe it wasn't the report, I don't know. But it was a very nice inclusion, I think, of that project.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm always very interested and intrigued by your plans and your sections, because there I can really find the knowledge that you have built and the changing situation in this regime, different regime of water. But often, when then I look at the perspectives or the representation, my interest fall down sometimes. It's not a critic, because you mentioned in an ironical way the comic style of engineers. Okay, I understand what you mean. But at the same time, the style of the representation of the new landscape coming out from this different paradigm sometimes lets me a bit perplexed. Sometimes I can't see. I see representation that seems like what you see after rain falling down, or after an atmospheric climatic phenomena, not after a project. So now I just want to hear something from you, some advice on how use this kind of representation, also for students, maybe.
This is a wonderful question, because I think I'm always also thinking about this. I think we don't have, let's say, the means of representation, which we have the tendency of doing in a very architectonic way. But actually, how do you combine, again, atmospheric, surface, subsurface conditions, no? So it's a sort of this interrelation between things, no? And also going to the Asian, let's say, more Asian philosophy and culture, this idea that there is no distinction, no, between natural processes and human activities. So it's all part of the same, historically, no, the way that things have been built. And I think we have the tendency yet to, do this plan section elevation and not really showing processes, in a more kind of intertwined way. So this relational design, for me, is something that it's a very interesting question from the point of view of representation throughout different scales. Yeah.
Well, very quick. Thank you, Ellen, for the question. I think it's a very interesting one. So there is, from one side, the fact probably there is too much architecture oriented, and maybe it's not just that. But I would just give a short answer. I think, and I agree, there is a kind of lack. I mean, I think we should return to observe an intermediate scale, really urban, which has been from this maybe from me, I've been too much neglected. And it's true that the link, even for students, in between this territorial and big images and like spatial transformation in the space in between things, let's put it like this, is less feasible. So this, for me, is very true.
Well, for me, I think the section is the most key for everything across scales. And I think the work of Paolo and Bernardo also always gave a lot of attention to the section in interesting ways. And I think this more experimental way of representation, I think actually the work of Anu and Dilip also that combined sections, very precise sections, engineer nerdy sections, but then with collage, with kind of textures and colors. And so to me, I think the precision and the kind of micro topographies of sections and kind of a section literally being above and below ground is the most telling. But then finding ways to animate it, I agree. I mean, for me also the 3Ds. Actually, I remember when I did my PhD a long time ago, showing it to Bernardo, and Bernardo said, "Can you take out all these Photoshops? They're really crap." And I said, "Yeah, but they're kind of needed by people." He said, "Oh, take them out." And I didn't listen to him, and I'm shooting myself that I should have listened to him, because they were the weakest part. No, I think there's a kind of necessity, like pressure to make them for some unnamed general public, but the precision of sections, but then the experimentation of it with textures and colors, I think is also, well, I think the whole Pennsylvania school, if you could say it, of mapping that started with Corner and the whole bunch of them, of playing with representation is really important. And I think the correct one, the formula isn't there yet, but I think it's the experimentation that makes it interesting. But I agree in the 3D things that maybe it's still difficult.
But good. I think we really went through different interesting themes. So starting from this water, that is so so many faces that you can really speak of everything. We didn't speak enough of history, so we have to find a moment in another occasion to also work maybe more, because here we try to make a genealogy. So in a way, only because of simplicity, we start from the pioneers. And then we arrive to the Parliament of Waters, so the idea of the right to the rivers, this kind of a very political and also quite large, largely discussed in this moment. So it's, but in a way, starting from this surface of today, we can really start to dig and to find many interesting aspects related to the way in which we see water, we work with water, and we represent water. Imagine that in the Venice until the 18th century, Venice and the big territory around Venice did not represent the roads, only the water lines, only the canals, only the rivers, not the rest. Just to give you an idea of a different hierarchy, a different perspective. I would like to come back a moment about the representation. I would say that the problematic aspect is for me that you have to elaborate explicitly about aesthetics, and in particular about the environmental aesthetics of today, which is not easy to represent, is not easy, not even to digest, and not everybody would agree on that. We have just made a nice seminar on Saturday afternoon in Paris at the Pavillon de l'Arsenal with 2 philosophers and one historian of gardens, parks, etc. And I don't remember who was the fourth, but in any case, really on this aspect of aesthetic, and it's extremely difficult and is very also politicized today, because it's changing, no? The way in which you represent, you think to the city, to the space of for example, a very protected heritage city like Paris, and climate change and the transformation related partially also to water are changing the landscape. And this landscape is becoming something new. There is not a plan that is establishing the way in which this landscape should change, but in a way, and behind there is this idea of wilderness, no? This aesthetic of wilderness. But in fact, the philosopher was exactly putting this as, okay, but are we really going this direction? Or should we discuss this direction. Is it the inevitable, the wilderness, or it is the only, I mean, because we really want, or there are other ways? So I think that the question of representation, and especially sections or perspective sections, you really have to express an idea, your position about also a new aesthetic that is transforming the territory. And coming back to the risk, that is also a very beautiful theme, I think, the theme of the risk. In this exhibition, we have put the work we did in the Valley of the Vesdre, between Belgium and Germany. It's a valley where a big flood happened in 2021. And of course, all the poor part of the population was in the lowest part of the valley, so the one that was flooded completely. And by reflecting on this valley, something that is very obvious when you work on water, that you have a problem of solidarity. It's not just a question of becoming more resilient, but it's the question of constructing a territorial solidarity. And water put this in a very, very clear way. So the solidarity is because the people that are living upstream, they produce a great part of the risk for the people that live downstream. Maybe they don't suffer because all the risk and all the catastrophe are in the lower part. And sometimes they don't even understand they are responsible, but in fact they are responsible. So when you start to put things in this way, it becomes very clear also politically why this solidarity has to be constructed in a territory. And I think that although very simple, could be looks like a little bit like ingenious, but in a way, if we would use the same idea to discuss many other questions, so where the problem is that there is a solidarity aspect that has to be discussed, whatever theme, the water is in a certain way, but could be, I don't know, the fertility of soils, or could be the production of food. There are so many questions where it's clear that it's not the one that is suffering the most that can find the solution for all the problems they have. So this is imposing, together with the reflection on resilience, a reflection on solidarity. And solidarity is a political matter. Resilience is partially scientific, is partially technical, but solidarity is absolutely something related to a political dimension. An ethical dimension. So I think that risk is imposing on us this reflection on resilience and solidarity together, and I'm convinced that you cannot disconnect the two. There is no resilience without solidarity. So if you want to be resilient, you have also to work on the dimension of solidarity. And there is this French scholar, Patrick Boucheron, that writes a lot about risk, and especially on the risk that our risks will become weapons in the hands of, let's say, politicians against us. No? Even climate change, with all this catastrophic approach, etc., we must be very, very careful, that's the position of Boucheron, on the fact that this would not be used against us, against people, communities, etc., as a very strong way not to put silence, when in fact you would like to express what you think. So again, this political dimension of risk is very important to discuss and to continue to discuss. And finally, and then I stop. Let's remember that we have constructed the risk. Who constructed the risk? Us. So, and we continue to construct the risk every single day. So maybe when we speak about risk, we should also speak about the us, what we do, and make a little bit of responsible thinking about what we have done, what we have realized. That's why we need some changes. And in a very synthetic and simple way, the exhibition tries to bring us some of those changes. But I hope that in the future we might enlarge this beginning. And of course, I would like to enlarge geographically, because this means to enlarge culturally. So that's fundamental. And also enlarge in terms of disciplines, different gazes, because also this, and also the dialogue between the different concepts, ideas, is still very much to be constructed, and I think there is a lot that could be done. I wanted also to take the occasion to tell you that the exhibition has been realized with the help of Archizoom. They especially took care a lot of the artistic interventions. They are very, very, very strong in this, I have to say, more than us. And Loan, that is there, together with Tommaso and myself, we made the timeline, let's say. And then there is a selection also of materials coming from the different courses, design studios, and the materials from the Lausanne Jardin, so this festival that every 5 years happened in Lausanne, so in which the different teams speak about their project. And Chiara is right, because now it has been closed, but this time Lausanne Jardin was really asking for a lot of thinking, because there was no nice garden to see practically. Not a flower, not a green, very, very few, but a lot of problems that were embedded into the garden construction. Okay, thank you very much to everybody.